Quick shout out to those who also drew Hitler mustaches on my posters, by the way. Oh. It's okay. And thank you for coming as well. I hope you enjoyed your experience. By the way, that's good news for a few people in the standby line. Quick shout out to people who are drawing Hitler mustaches on my poster, by the way. Two problems there. First, I'm an Orthodox Jew. Second, I've been trying to grow facial hair for years, and it's just not working. Okay, now to the actual topic of this speech. America wasn't built on slavery, it was built on freedom. Now, the reason for this speech is that we are actually in the midst of a great internal conflict in the United States about the very nature of the country. The conflict surrounds a very simple question. Are we a nation or are we not? On the one side lie many Americans, mostly conservatives, who argue that we are indubitably a nation, unified by history, by culture, by language. The most contentious part of this statement is not the part about culture or language. We all basically agree that we should speak the same language. I'm not even talking about Spanish versus English. I mean that we should be able to understand each other when we have a conversation. Or culture, in which we sort of understand that we share a culture, we watch the same TV shows, and we experience the same sports, and we have all of these cultural totems. The most contentious part of the statement is that we're unified by our history. Now, the traditional view of American history goes something like this. America was built on eternally good and true principles springing from both the Judeo-Christian ethic and English culture rooted in natural law. Those principles were denied in practice by many of the same people who promoted them in theory. But those theories were valid, and they remain valid today. The story of America, therefore, is really a story of the broadening application of those principles, the perfection of our union, the fulfillment of the promises of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. That's the traditional story of what America is. Now, that view certainly does not deny, nor should it deny, the evils and horrors of slavery and Jim Crow, or the savage brutality of the dispossession of Native Americans. But this view does recognize a simple truth. The state of the world historically has been replete with evil and horror and brutality, and America, unlike other nations, has fought over time to wipe them away at home and abroad. In this view, the story of America doesn't begin in 1776, but 1776 does represent the breaking point with the past, the statement of our cherished principles. The story of America is the story of a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Then there's the alternative view of American history. This view suggests that America is not, in fact, a true nation. America is instead an agglomeration of competing interests, forced together by circumstance and by fate, damned to interminable struggle. America is a story of exploitation and greed, of patriarchy and abuse, of hierarchy and manipulation. America's story is an unending litany of horrors punctuated by brief respites, always sliding back into the damnable bacterial soup from whence we sprang. Racism, as Barack Obama suggested, is in America's DNA. In 2015, the president elected by 69.5 million Americans in 2008 explained, quote, "The legacy of slavery, Jim Crow discrimination is in almost every institution of our lives. You know, that casts a long shadow, and that's still part of our DNA that's passed on. We're not cured of it. Racism we are not cured of, clearly." Now, Obama's mantle was picked up this year by the Democrats' second favorite fake minority, Beto O'Rourke, a man who has not been dinged for cultural appropriation over his name, but happens to be whiter than any person in America not named Elizabeth Warren. Sorry. Beto, cribbing from the New York Times 1619 Project in his quixotic quest for relevance, suggested that America was founded on racism and slavery. He said, quote, "Racism in America is endemic, brah. It is foundational. We can mark the creation of this country not at the 4th of July, 1776, but August 20th, 1619. When the first kidnapped American was brought to this country against his will, and in bondage as a slave, and built the greatness and success and wealth that neither he nor his descendants would be able to fully participate in and enjoy." Now, lest you think that Beto's perspective on America is retrospective, Beto brought it up to date in late October. America, he said, is still racist at its foundation, at its core, and throughout the system. And then, of course, he became completely irrelevant. Now he's off eating dirt in New Mexico or something. By the way, it should be noted that Beto said all of this while calling for Americans to elect him, a white man, a very privileged white man, to the highest office in the land. White privilege, shaking my damn head. So, which is it? Which values more represent America, the America to which we all belong? Racism and slavery and Jim Crow, or the freedoms posited in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States? Because both of these things are part of our history, undoubtedly, but the question is which is more defining of the country, of our history, and in which we live? Obviously and undeniably, again, slavery is the darkest part of American history. It was unforgivable, horrific, brutal, vicious, unthinkable. But is it the root of American history, or did it represent a sinful, deeply sinful straying from founding principles rectified over time? Was America founded and built on freedom or on slavery? To examine this question, we have to start at the founding. To support the notion that America was built on slavery, advocates of the revisionist school of historical thought about the country point out that many of America's founding fathers were slaveholders, that the Declaration of Independence didn't abolish slavery, and thus its high-handed declarations of natural rights and equality among men were a mirage, and that the Constitution expressly permitted slavery. Let's take each of these arguments in turn. First, it's undeniable, of course, that many of America's founding fathers were slaveholders. You have to begin with the fact that at the time of the founding, Britain had not outlawed slaveholding or the slave trade in its colonies, and would not do so until the British Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, and would not outlaw slavery among its charter companies until 1843. Slavery was legal in Great Britain proper, legally, until 1807. That means that slavery was widespread across the planet and that the United States was no exception. According to Henry Louis Gates, over the period 1525 to 1866, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World in the transatlantic slave trade. They endured the unthinkably horrible Middle Passage. Many died in transport of disease, starvation, or suicide. Of those 12.5 million human beings, approximately 10.7 million arrived in the New World. How many of those landed in North America directly? About 388,000. This is not to excuse a single kidnapping, enslavement, or sale of a human being. Each one of these was a crime against man and against God, and we all agree on this. It is to point out that the United States was certainly not unique at the time of the founding in allowing slaveholding. It was common across the planet, including in Western countries. With that said, where did the founders actually stand on the question of slavery? Well, 41 of the 56 founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence did hold slaves. But the founding fathers, including many people who did hold slaves, were well aware that slavery was a moral abomination. This was the conflict at the heart of the American founding. John Adams, from Boston, stated, "My opinion against it has always been known. Never in my life did I own a slave." He stated that, quote, "Every measure of prudence, therefore, ought to be assumed for the eventual total extirpation of slavery from the United States." Samuel Adams said, "But to the eye of reason, what can be more clear than that all men have an equal right to happiness?" Benjamin Franklin became the head of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society after at one point in his young life owning slaves, and stated, quote, that mankind are all formed by the same almighty being, alike objects of his care, and equally designed for the enjoyment of happiness. The Christian religion teaches us to believe, and the political creed of Americans fully coincides with the position. We earnestly entreat your serious attention to the subject of slavery, that you will be pleased to countenance the restoration of liberty to those unhappy men who alone in this land of freedom are degraded into perpetual bondage and who are groaning in servile subjection. John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, stated, quote, that men should pray and fight for their own freedom and yet keep others in slavery is certainly acting a very inconsistent as well as unjust and perhaps impious part. Jay and Alexander Hamilton were among the men who created the New York Manumission Society in 1787 for the freeing of slaves. Governor Morris, one of the founding fathers, said slavery was a, quote, nefarious institution and described, quote, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Benjamin Rush, another founding father, domestic slavery is repugnant to the principles of Christianity. It is rebellion against the authority of a common father. It is a practical denial of the extent and efficacy of the death of a common savior. It is a usurpation of the prerogative of the great sovereign of the universe who has solemnly claimed an exclusive property in the souls of men. George Washington stated, "I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." It is no wonder that Pennsylvania and Massachusetts moved to abolish slavery in 1780, Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, Vermont in 1786, New Hampshire in 1792, New York in 1799, New Jersey in 1804. Many of the founding fathers released their own slaves as well, including George Washington, John Dickinson, Caesar Rodney, John Randolph, and others. Thomas Jefferson is most often cited on this score because he was indeed a massive hypocrite on slavery. But he was well aware of his own hypocrisy. Jefferson wrote that slavery destroyed the morals of the people as well as their industry. In fact, Jefferson suggested that slavery would bring disaster upon the nation. Quote, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, Whether considering numbers, nature, and natural means alone, a revolution of the wheel of fortune and an exchange of situations among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference, the Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. In 1778, Jefferson actually, very early in his career, even introduced a bill to ban importation of slaves into Virginia, hoping for slavery's, quote, final eradication. This conflict carried forward into the Declaration of Independence. The original draft of the Declaration of Independence included a clause written by Thomas Jefferson ripping into the British Empire for supposedly imposing slavery on the colonies. The original clause suggested, quote, he, this would be King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. It was, of course, Southern colonists who decided that they were not going to sign on to a Declaration of Independence that included such language. The Declaration of Independence and its credo that all men are created equal was not meant to exclude slaves philosophically. It was meant to encompass everyone, which is why it was so easy for the Declaration of Independence to be extended to include everybody. You didn't have to change any of the language. This is why ex-slave and second founding father, yes, he should be on our currency, Frederick Douglass, described the great principles contained by the Declaration of Independence. Douglass stated, quote, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give fame to a great age. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. Douglass's great cry for freedom arose from his invocation of exactly those founding principles. He said, quote, are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? That was the question that he sought to have answered. And that was a question that wouldn't be answered, obviously, until the Civil War. Okay, how about the Constitution of the United States? The argument is made that the Constitution of the United States is a slavery document. Well, the Founding Fathers actually believed that they had placed slavery on the road to extinction even before the Constitution was written. The Northwest Ordinance, signed by George Washington in 1787, banned slavery in new territories. Those territories would later become the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. There were approximately, at the time of the founding, 60,000 free black Americans living in the United States. The Constitution of the United States banned importation of slaves beyond 1808. The infamous 3/5 clause, which counted slaves as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of congressional apportionment, was designed to prevent increased slaveholding power. That's what it was designed to do. It was not meant to deride black Americans. It was meant to stop slaveholding states from having additional power in the Congress of the United States. Because if you counted slaves fully, that would have boosted Southern representation in Congress without increasing the number of actual voting citizens. The Constitution of the United States makes no overt reference to slavery, avoiding enshrining slavery in federal law. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, wrote that it would be wrong to place in the Constitution any admission of the idea that there could be, quote, property in men. All of this is why Frederick Douglass was correct to call the Constitution of the United States a glorious liberty document. He thundered, read its preamble, consider its purposes. Is slavery among them? Is it at the gateway? Is it in the temple? It is neither. As Lincoln noted in his 1860 Cooper Union speech, 22 of the 39 framers of the Constitution voted on the Northwest Ordinance. 20 voted in favor of the legislation. One of the other framers, George Washington, was the president who signed it. In 1794, the founders prohibited export of slaves, the selling of American slaves abroad. In 1798, they prohibited importation of slaves into the Mississippi Territory. In 1807, Congress effectuated the ban on importation of slaves codified in the Constitution a year before they were even legally allowed to do so, so that on the date of 1808, laid forth in the Constitution, importation of slaves into the United States would be banned. Okay, now we move on to the Civil War. None of this ended the cruelties of slavery, obviously. Despite the best efforts of many of the founders, slavery continued to explode in numbers in the United States. That was largely due to the invention of the cotton gin, which suddenly made intensive agriculture in southern states a worthwhile pursuit economically. By the time of the Civil War, some 4 million slaves were held in the United States, held by just under 400,000 slaveholders, according to the United States Census in 1860. Southern advocates began to argue the morality of slavery, particularly John C. Calhoun, who was a vicious white supremacist and did serve as vice president of the United States. And they started to insist that the federal government enshrine slavery for all time, force free states to return escaped slaves, and allow for the expansion of slavery into new territories. But here's the thing. The story of America is not a story of unending tolerance for slavery. Far from it. The intransigent backwardness of slaveholding states led to the bloodiest war in the history of America, with over 600,000 human beings dead. Hundreds of thousands of men marched into battle singing the battle hymn of the Republic. And the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic say, as he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. The purpose of the Civil War was quite clear. The original lyrics, by the way, were even more militant. They centered around John Brown, who was an abolitionist militant who led a raid at Harper's Ferry. He tried to lead a slave uprising of black Americans at Harper's Ferry. The original lyrics to the Battle Hymn of the Republic, it was called John Brown's Body. And the original lyrics said, John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, his soul is marching on. Now, it's true that Abraham Lincoln didn't originally stand in favor of emancipation. His mandate, as elected, was to effectuate union, not to free the slaves. But it was obvious what his agenda was, which is exactly why the South tried to secede, right? He had said all of this in his House Divided speech in 1858, quote, I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all of the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. And it was obvious which side of that ledger Lincoln came down on. As president, therefore, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. He rammed through the Republican Congress the 13th Amendment barring slavery. Weeks later, he was assassinated. In 1866, the House of Representatives passes the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment guaranteeing black Americans the right to vote passes Congress in 1869. And so slavery ends in the United States. And due process and equal protection of the laws is guaranteed, at least legally, to those who had been held in cruel bondage. Freedom triumphed, at least on paper. But freedom didn't, of course, fully triumph, because in the aftermath of the Civil War, after so-called radical Republicans pressed for federal protection of black Americans, the effort collapsed. Southern states reinstituted brutal racist laws. The KKK became a massive force in the South, enforcing its racist evil with the rope and the gun. Schemes of segregation and Jim Crow became the norm in old Confederate states. Sharecropping replaced slavery. Legalized terrorism against black Americans was commonplace, and the federal government did nearly nothing. Black Americans pressed on, heroically fighting for the freedoms that they had been promised in the Declaration of Independence and then promised again by Lincoln and the radical Republicans. They fought for their freedom, day in and day out, the right to live free of legally mandated discrimination, their right to rise economically, their right to prosper in liberty. And of course, they met amazing, tremendous resistance from awful human beings like Woodrow Wilson, a person who actually showed The Birth of a Nation, you know, the pro-KKK D.W. Griffith film. He showed it at the White House to FDR, who signed into law the deeply flawed GI Bill that would deny effective benefits to black Americans, particularly in the South. Redlining was common practice. Educational opportunities were barred to black Americans, and yet, still, black Americans rose. The black poverty rate fell from 87% in 1940 to 47% by 1960, with Jim Crow in place, which is an unbelievable accomplishment. It's an amazing accomplishment. The black middle class grew. And then came the Civil Rights Movement, the most important victory for freedom over slavery since the end of the Civil War. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, of this university, led the charge, citing the founders and America's original ideals. On August 12, 1963, King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, perfectly fitting, and intoned the timeless words that still shock us with truth and vision. He said, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.